We'll go ahead and get started. It's a little after time. We're going to pick up where we've left off at the beginning of John chapter 10. And we're going to try and cover the whole chapter this morning. So there'll be some details that we don't get to talk about.
So we're just going to skip like the first 22
the
and
first,
start there.
That's right. There are a couple things that we do want to highlight as we're going through. One of the things, obviously at the beginning, we have this discourse about Jesus being the good shepherd, which is going to come from Ezekiel 34. It's kind of the backdrop for that. And then you also have Jesus at another festival when you get down to verse 22 at the Feast of Dedication, or you may know it as Hanukkah or the Festival of Lights, 8 Crazy Nights. I don't know, all the different names that we have for that now. But that's what that is the Feast of Dedication. So we'll just go back to the beginning and we'll start working our way through with this statement, or these several statements in verses 1 through 6 where Jesus talks about being the good shepherd, or he's going to make that statement. So with this image in verses 1 through 6, what were some things that stood out to you guys, or what were some things that you noticed? Do we have a microphone? Up here.
Well, looking at the big picture here, do you think this is one continuing discourse, or down in verse 7 it says he said again to them? So I'm kind of wondering if this is several different occasions that's crunched into one narrative here, or do you think it's a continuing discourse?
I can see it either way.
Yeah.
If it's spread out, it makes sense why.
That's kind of the way I lean on it, because it looks like he takes a little different viewpoint with what he's talking about in the second section of this, starting in verse 7. So it seems like to me that maybe it's that when it says he says again to them, that it's maybe later or a different time.
Yeah, and it could even be later in the same day, where he
Yeah.
kind of picks up the same figure and
Yeah.
uses it in a different way.
Yeah, I was going to just suggest that verses 1 through 6, I think, is tied directly to the end of chapter 9. Christ never uses that truly, truly, or verily, verily, without a prior discussion where he's making the point that absolutely needs to be understood. So this is, in context, that first part, certainly 1 through 6, I think, fit to chapter 9, because the picture he's painting is just another version of what he's been saying through those last 3 or 4 chapters anyways, about you got to come to me, you got to hear me, the Lord knows who he is, and that kind of thing.
And that helps us to identify who are the false shepherds,
Yep.
or the ones who are breaking in to steal. It would be those religious leaders.
Exactly.
He kind of just, it is a continuation. He does kind of jump into this description of how shepherding sheep and where sheep are stored, how that whole process works. And then it says they didn't understand this figure of speech. So he kind of just jumps into this, there's a door to the sheep, and then someone watches over them and brings them out and brings them back in, and they're kind of just like, what? Because they didn't get who he was applying it to. And then so he goes back in and probably reiterates something that he had said before, to maybe give them some clarity on that as far as I'm the door.
Yeah.
So, when you read things like this, you try to figure out, well, who's the shepherd and who's the doorkeeper and what's the fold, and it seems to switch as he goes through this, because at one point he says, I'm the door, and then he says, I'm the shepherd, and then the fold seems to change between the first part of the chapter and the middle. So it's a bit, you have to kind of go with the flow here. It's not a this represents Jesus and this represents this. It's a flowing metaphor here.
Yeah, and that's a good point, that the Bible doesn't use figures of speech in the way that we like to use figures of speech. For example, if you ever turned in a paper, maybe in English class or something, and you maybe got marked off for using a mixed metaphor, where you use a single picture 2 different ways, or you're kind of blending images together, we mark off for that in our writing, because we don't like that. Mixed metaphors are bad. They're hard to work through. The biblical speakers love mixed metaphors. And so they mix things up all the time. For example, in the letter to the Galatians, when Paul starts talking about the two women and there's two mountains, and he blends these things in three different ways, and you're like, Paul, you would have failed senior English. And so one of my problems is I kind of have to step back sometimes, and I have to realize that the speakers and the writers in the Bible, they aren't bound by my conventions. Right? Jesus can take this image and he can kind of move it around to make the points that he needs to make. And that's one of the reasons why I think we see this. It's probably different times. Like Tim said, the first discussion is at the end of chapter 9, everything that's happening there. And then Jesus is going to build on that later. Because I think the Ezekiel 34 backdrop is really his point, is his emphasis, is that Ezekiel talks about shepherds in Israel. The shepherds were not doing their job. They're not tending the sheep. They're not instructing the people on the way. So God is going to replace them and come himself as the shepherd. And I think that's really hit the point that he's driving home. In every image that he uses, there is a shepherding role that he is fulfilling. And about the gate, that has driven me crazy for years. And I just read this past week, somebody noted that it was common to have a shepherd at a very large sheepfold where you would have several different flocks, to have a shepherd, an under shepherd, sit at the gate and kind of open it and close it and let the sheep in and out. And he was just referred to as the gate.
Mm-hmm.
And so
In fact, when you go back to the Old Testament, Psalms 23 and David, as I understand, the practice was in the field they would build like a briar patch, take all the briars around and make a wall, let the sheep in, and then the shepherd would sleep in the opening. So if you had to get in there, you were going to go through the shepherd to get to the sheep. And that's the picture I think he's painting here, augmented by what you just said.
yeah.
And so it's different for us today. And they would also understand that several shepherds might get together and build one. So you could have 3 or 4 flocks together, and they would all, if there were whatever opening was, that's where the shepherd was to protect and to keep care for their sheep and make sure they're safe through the night while they slept.
Yeah, so he's kind of, what we see is he's fulfilling all the shepherding roles. And it's a really beautiful picture. He protects the sheep. He makes sure they get what they need. It really is the fulfillment of what God says in Ezekiel 34, that I will come and shepherd my sheep because you guys aren't doing a good job. And if you kind of consider John 9 and the flow into this discussion, here you have a perfect example of what bad shepherding looks like. This incredible miracle has occurred, which is the fulfillment of Isaiah 42, where the blind would receive back their sight, of the coming of the Lord's servant. And instead of rejoicing, the Pharisees kind of hold a tribunal, or the religious leaders hold a tribunal, and they excommunicate the guy who was healed. This is the worst possible approach to what has just happened. They declare that anybody who professes Jesus will be cast out of the synagogue, and the man who was healed, the one who is the fulfillment of Isaiah 42, you cast him out. And that gets into this discussion about, you guys are terrible shepherds, I'm taking over. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing going on. Does that make sense?
It does.
We talk about back to the mixing metaphors thing, which mixing metaphors today is a critique, but that doesn't apply here.
Right.
So, and the very good point was made that he fulfills all shepherding roles. With the changing of the metaphor, the pivoting of how the metaphor is applied, with him being the shepherd and the gate and the door. And if you take another passage in another place in the Bible, he's the way and he's the light. So when he's applying what his role is to all these different things, he's like almost everything. He's the one leading us down himself. He's lighting the way. He is the opening, and he's what's keeping us safe and all these other things.
So we speculate on what the sheepfold is, and I think to come to a conclusion or speculation about what he's talking about specifically there, we have to take into consideration what he says later, that he has sheep that are not of this fold. So the fold that he's talking about originally seems to be one setting, But then he says, well, that's not going to be the only one, though. I've got sheep that aren't part of this fold. So my assumption is that he's talking about some, in this first metaphor here, or figure of speech here, he's talking about some segment of the Jewish population. And then he says, I have sheep that are not of this fold. We'd be talking about also the Gentiles are going to be brought in to the fold also.
That's how I understand it. And I think that's kind of, again, going back to the prophets, you have this image of God building up the nation of Israel, or to borrow from Amos, rebuilding the tabernacle of David. And being brought into that is all the nations. You know, the glory of all the nations will be brought into the tent of David, to the house of David. And I think that's exactly right. I think that's what you see there. Jesus is sent, he'll say in another place, I was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And so here he is gathering together the lost sheep, and he's got other sheep that he's going to bring into this fold also, and I think those are the Gentiles. That historically has been the way that Christians have understood that image, and nobody ever suggested that there was anything else until the early 1800s. And so if you hear anybody suggest that maybe there were lost tribes of Israel that were on the North American continent, not even on the radar. Not for 1,800 years. So I think you've nailed it.
If Jesus had just, this is kind of on brand for him, if he had just come out and said, you guys are bad shepherds, they would have been really mad and they would have wanted to like punish him. But him just saying, by him saying, I'm the good shepherd, he's just so heavily insinuating in a way that everyone there knows that he's saying they're the bad shepherds. That's almost like, I would imagine that would push them over the edge to want to like kill him at that point. Just that sort of just blatant, critical identifying them as not good shepherds by just calling him the bad shepherd. You know, it's a horrible example. I'm really sorry I'm doing this, but if it was just me and you up here and I just said, I'm the good preacher, like you'd probably be like, it's just in a way that Jesus was very good at, and they definitely deserved to hear, but they didn't take it to heart or anything. So
Yeah, and he says it in a way, he's absolutely chastising them, but he says it in a way that lets them, if they wanted to, save face. So he kind of gives them a way out. You know, oh, you're the good shepherd, then all you have to do then is say, then I'll stop and come to you, and then I can be part of the fold. And so there's this sense in which he's taking what God has already said, he's applying it to their current situation in a very powerful way, but even in doing so, he still gives them a way back. And it's beautiful the way he does it. He points out what is wrong. He highlights the things that they have done that are wrong, but he still gives them a way back. There will be a point where that kind of stops, where it becomes clear that this is not working anymore, and that's where you get into the Matthew 23 Jesus. But here at this point, I think you're seeing that absolutely, but there's a way back. And that's an important part of the gospel, because the gospel confronts us in our shortcomings. It shows us where we fail. It shows us that we aren't good enough, but there's a way back. And that's why it's the good news, is because there is a good shepherd. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you read stories of especially shepherds in Palestine during this day, but maybe even up to this point in time, that the sheep recognize the shepherd's voice, and he has them all named, and he knows all their names, which is pretty remarkable. To me, one sheep, how do you tell them apart? It's a sheep, but he knows their names. But the question is, how? He says that they will follow him, for they know his voice. When you apply that to what he's really talking about, how would people recognize the voice of the shepherd that he's talking about, the Messiah? And I think you've already referred to the prophets a couple of times, and I think that's the answer. If they were knowledgeable of the prophets and willing to listen to what the prophet says, they're going to recognize the fact that, hey, this guy is who they were talking about, so that's how they would know who he is.
Yeah. We have a microphone. And just to kind of add to, in John 6, Jesus says, I speak the words of my Father. And so that's how you know.
Are the hired men who are not willing to lay down their lives for the sheep, the Pharisees?
I think so. Yeah, I think they're the religious leaders of the Jews, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. They would rather sacrifice the sheep to keep their position, which ties right back to John 9 with that blind man.
It also kind of goes back to this thing we've been seeing a lot, where they're misguided or incorrect expectations of what the Messiah would be. So I think they're probably expecting some sort of like Moses-like exodus in the current days, in the end time, Moses coming back and leading them out of whatever they're in now, or something to that effect. Maybe that's what their expectations would be, and that kind of goes back to like Moses was a shepherd, leading the children of Egypt, but also God was the shepherd because he guided them with a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day.
Yeah.
So now we're back on the metaphors getting interchanged and stuff like that. But I think it just goes back to their constant misguided expectations of what the Messiah would be, and possibly them knowing the scripture but not understanding it in the correct way, or maybe understanding it in the correct way but just adamantly refusing to see it or acknowledge it when it presents itself to them.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and it's a very humbling point. Because the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, I mean, they get embarrassed a lot in the New Testament. But they're debating with Jesus. Right? They're very intelligent people. They are the most learned people in the ancient world regarding the scriptures. Most of them probably have it memorized. I would be surprised, in fact, if all of them didn't have it memorized. And that's a feat. And so it is very humbling to come and look and say, if those people couldn't figure it out on their own, then it's very unlikely that I'm going to figure it out on my own. And I need somebody to guide me. Jesus was there guiding him. They just, like you mentioned, they refused that guidance. And so it is, I identify a lot with the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the mistakes they make, and in their need for somebody to show them the way.
I have to when I put myself in their shoes back then, I have to admit that I would definitely be one of them. I don't see myself, my personality, who I am, in being one of them, being able to acknowledge that I'm seeing the Messiah. My hard heart would keep me from doing that. No matter how scriptures, I just identify with them. I identify with Peter a lot in some ways, but I also identify with the scribes and Pharisees and just their refusal to acknowledge Jesus.
You've got to remember what the motivation behind their rejection was. It was common expectation that this was when the Messiah was going to appear based on Daniel's writings. And so it was, and we're told in other places, Gamaliel, I think it was, that listed several guys who'd shown up and claimed to be it. So it was not a foreign concept at all that this was the time for the Messiah. But he didn't come in the way that they expected him to. And what they were seeing was a threat to their status. And John lays that out very clearly, that the reason they rejected him is because they were afraid they were going to lose their positions. If he caused this uproar and Rome came in and stomped it out, then they weren't going to be in charge anymore. So their motives were not pure in rejecting Jesus. It was really a very self-centered approach that they took to this whole thing.
Yeah, I think coming back to what you said about how do you know the shepherd's voice? Well, he uses the scriptures. I think that's the power of that, is that when he comes, you can't argue with him because he's just saying, look at what God said, now you see the fulfillment. And he puts you in a position where you have to choose. Are you going to listen to God, or are you going to keep defending your status, your position, or whatever it is, to where you have to pick. Are you going to serve God, or are you going to serve mammon? And it comes down, it still, to this day, comes down to that choice. Oh, we've got...
I think it's important that when Jesus delivers all his messages, there's perfect timing for him. And for this one in particular, he felt like he needed to identify himself, and how would they identify him? That number one, they would recognize his voice. The second one just completely fell out there. But that he would be the one that would come through the gate and not the roof. But all of these, that they would be able to recognize him. And he's not a shepherd, but he is the good shepherd. He is the only shepherd, because there's lots of shepherds trying to guide them. But I think these first 6 verses and even the following 3 help him to be identified as the one.
Yeah, he does kind of identify himself as the good shepherd, and being one with God, and then the Pharisees as being the bad shepherds. He does tie in there too that I think we have to gather from his words here that he is the only way to God. So not only is he, there have been good shepherds, you know, the prophets and David and all them, but I think in his identifying himself as the good shepherd and them the bad shepherds, he's also tying in there that he's the only way to eternal life.
Yeah, and if you're familiar with the prophets, which they would have been, for somebody to come along after Ezekiel and say, I am the good shepherd, that is basically a claim to divinity. You know, there are some things that we wouldn't say today. Like you would never hear somebody say, I am the I am. Right? We just wouldn't do that, because you know what that means if you're familiar with the New Testament text and the Old Testament. Well, once Ezekiel talks about God coming to be the good shepherd of the people Israel, you would never say, I am the good shepherd of the people Israel. You just wouldn't do it. And that's why, to kind of bring it up to the end there, leading into verse 22, that's why there is division amongst the Jews. I mean, what would happen here today if somebody claimed to be the Messiah? What would you do? Well, we would have questions for them, and maybe they would convince some people, and other people wouldn't believe, and there would be division and discussion, and we would have to figure out what's going on. That's what's happening, is somebody has showed up in the midst of, like Dawn said, a flurry of people claiming to be Messiah. That there's this messianic expectation because the prophets said there was going to be one, and now here's another guy saying, not only am I the Messiah, but I'm also God. There's going to be division about that. And so that's what's happening. It's not a benign statement. I mean, it is, because he's telling the truth. But it's a very pointed statement, to where now you have to make a choice. He either is insane, he has a demon, or he is the divine Son of God come in the flesh. You have to choose. And that's where you get to the end there. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? That's a powerful question. And that is coming back to the works that he's done. And Jesus will say repeatedly, if you don't believe me, believe the works. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? Not according to Isaiah 42. Right? That was going to be the servant who is coming, who will open the eyes of the blind. And Jesus did that. So now, who is Jesus?
Another thing that strikes me through this first section down through about verse 18 is that not long before this, when he had made the statement of before Abraham I am, and they tried to kill him, he doesn't back off of that at all. He's still using that I am the door. He says that twice. I am the shepherd, and he says that twice. And then in a couple of chapters over, he's going to say that I am the way, the truth, and the life, and nobody comes to the. So he was not intimidated by the threat of violence, and he just keeps right on with this use of language that, as you pointed out, directly ties him to making claims for divinity.
Yeah. And I've heard somebody say before, well, Jesus never claims to be God in all of the New Testament. It's like, well, if you know the Old Testament, he does it a lot. And that's the issue, is he doesn't come straight out and say it until his trial. I mean, he pretty much says that he's the Christ at his trial. But he's making that statement all throughout, to the point where, like you were saying,
They know what he's saying.
they know exactly what he's saying,
Yeah.
and he's using the scriptures to say it. So how can you argue against it? You have to argue against him from a biblical standpoint, and every time they do that, they're embarrassed. It's you just have to choose, is ultimately what it comes down to, is will you believe or won't you? And I think that's one of the reasons why we're told that it divides the heart. It shows your intentions. Are your intentions to be faithful to the Lord and to obey, or do you have some ulterior motive? Now we'll see.
Imagine Jesus' claim to divinity was much more authentic in that, as you're saying, he's using the scriptures and these key words. Those that know the scriptures will immediately get. I can only imagine that those that came before Jesus claiming to be the Messiah just walked around straight up claiming to be the Messiah. Jesus does it in a way without saying, I am God or anything like that until later. He just uses the scriptures so that it seems more genuine and the actual Messiah do when he gets here, as opposed to saying, hey, it's me, I'm here.
Yeah.
I think another particularly significant thing that he says in this middle section here is he several times talks about laying down his life. He starts with, up in verse 11, the good shepherd lays down his life. But then he says several times, I lay down my life, 3 or 4 times. But then down towards the end of that section in verse 18, he says, I lay it down of my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down, and I have the authority to take it up again. And so that seems to be another trigger here, just like I before Abraham was, I am. This seems to be another trigger where they go, oh, what, this guy's crazy, because he's seemingly saying, I'm going to voluntarily give my life up, but then I have the authority to bring myself back. And so that's a pretty radical statement too.
Yeah, who can give life to the dead but God? And he just said, I can give life to the dead. So it's...
And you can give life to yourself. Like, how can a dead person bring himself back to life?
Yeah, that's even more powerful, is that not only does he have the authority to raise the dead, but he has that life in himself. Who else could you say that about? Yeah.
Tied to that, which is absolutely on point, it's interesting, verses 12 and 13, he defines someone who's not a good shepherd as a hireling, which he would be if he didn't go to the cross. He's putting his own life on the line here and stating, here's what it looks like, here's what you need to see. And I suspect some in Acts 2 are going to look back, remember this, and turn to Jesus because of that. They're going to realize he was the good shepherd. He didn't leave. He didn't run.
Yeah, one of my favorite statements of Jesus in John is in chapter 12. When I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. I think you're exactly right. All right, so let's move into the Feast of Dedication, or we'll run out of time. We will anyway. So the Feast of Dedication is Hanukkah. And if you are familiar with the Old Testament, the 37 books that we have in our Old Testament, you will notice that Hanukkah is not in it. And so that leads people to ask, well, where did it come from and what is it? There is a revolt that we talked about when we were going through the 12, the Maccabean revolt. The Greeks come in for a little while, they take over the region, the Jews will rebel, and when they are cleansing the temple, they don't have oil to cleanse, enough to keep the lamps burning in the temple, to cleanse the temple, to dedicate the temple to God again. And the Feast of Dedication is the story of a day's worth of oil lasting for 8 days so that they could rededicate the temple and have sacrifices there again. And so the Jews celebrated that annually with the Feast of Dedication. And that came to be Hanukkah. Now, like we said, it's not in the text. But here is Jesus at a religious celebration that is not in the text, and he's partaking in it. Do with that what you will. And we will move on then into the rest of the section. If you have questions about that, we'll be happy to talk about that later.
Stephen will be happy to talk about that later.
Yes. And so then we'll just get into what he says when he is at the temple teaching. At the very least, there's going to be tons of people here. And Jesus does what Jesus does. He shows up where the people are, when the people are, and he says things appropriate to what they need to hear. So now there's all this buzz about him. Is he a demon? Is he really the Messiah? And so he shows up at this festival, and he starts on with this again. My sheep hear my voice. Tell us whether or not you are the Christ. And the response is, my sheep hear my voice. So in that section, what do you guys see that's going on there?
One, just it's not important to the overall situation, but this Colonnade of Solomon is kind of interesting because evidently that was the only part of the original temple that wasn't destroyed by the Babylonians. So Herod's temple had been rebuilt, but he had left this colonnade that was built by Solomon because of its historical significance. So he's walking there in the only part of the temple that still remained from the original one.
That's pretty neat.
I could be wrong on this, obviously, but to me, he seems resolved, almost closer to the point where he's saying, okay, we have to try something else with them. When they're just pelting him with these questions, and I imagine it's very, very crowded, and he's just saying, you know what, my sheep hear my voice. The ones I came to save, they hear me, I'm speaking to them, and that's really all I can worry about at this point. Those that don't believe me are refusing to believe me and have since I got here. So maybe he's just sort of resolved to at least saying out loud, the ones that want to hear me are hearing me, and that's what I'm here for.
Yeah, and that's in the prophets too. Those who have ears, they have ears but they don't hear, they have eyes but they don't see. And I think you're right. And that should help us understand what's going on when we try and teach people the gospel. There are going to be people who just don't want to hear what you have to say. You didn't say it wrong. You didn't do something bad by trying to talk about Jesus. There are people who just don't want to hear. And in a way, that's part of the work that the gospel does. It's a winnowing fork. It keeps the grain and it separates that out from the chaff. Jesus comes, in Matthew 25, he talks putting the sheep and the goats on the right and the left. And the good thing about all this is you don't have to make that decision yourself. Right? You don't have to decide who is going to be saved and who isn't. Our job is to teach about Jesus. And that will happen. It will have whatever effect it has. And then on the last day, Jesus will do the separating. So our job is not to go out and make decisions about who needs to hear and who doesn't to hear. Our job is to go out and let everybody hear, and then God will take care of the rest. And so it's comforting to me to see that even with Jesus teaching, sometimes it just gets to the point where he's like, you're not listening, so I'm going to talk to the people who will.
So in verse 30, he says, I am the Father of one, and that triggers them again. And they pick up stones to stone him. Every time it reaches a point where he makes that claim, they go after him physically. And I think you mentioned personally, they insult him. They can't argue with the case that he's building, so they resort to other means. But I want to get down to this section before we run out of time, down in the middle of that paragraph. Well, maybe too late already. Where he quotes from Psalm 82, and get your take on what he's talking about there. If he says it's written in your law, which is an interesting way to describe the Psalms, by the way, but he says, you are gods with a little g. If he called them gods, to whom the word of God came and Scripture cannot be broken, then why do you say that I can't be God, is the argument he's making. So talk a little bit about this idea of we are little g gods.
That's the loudest little g in the history of the universe. And so this is something that this is again something that you and I would never say. Like if we're sitting in casual conversation, we wouldn't say, we are gods, right? I mean, we just wouldn't say that. But Jesus is okay with saying that. And it's in the Psalms, like you mentioned. There is this concept in what we are looking forward to, and this is very prevalent in early Christian writings, that what we are looking forward to is a union with God himself. We will be, to borrow Peter's language, we will become partakers of the divine nature. Now, that doesn't mean that you are going to become equal to God. It doesn't mean that you will become a god of some other realm. None of that. What it means is that you will become a being who has a body like Christ's resurrected body, and you will live eternally. You have become a partaker of the divine nature. You have been united in this way with the Lord through the Spirit, and so you have been elevated, in a sense, from just dirt into something different. And that is the way that the early Christians would have explained this. They would have called the word that they would use in Greek is theodosis. And that's how they would have explained it. You are becoming like God in the sense that you will be immortal, for lack of a better term.
And also, in what I read, the rabbis in the Talmud and the Mishnah, they thought this was applied to the leaders of the people. Because when you go through Psalms 82, it is not a commendation. It says you're in a position of authority and you're not doing it correctly, and you're going to be punished for that. And so even the Jews hearing this at this time, the Pharisees would not, they're going to struggle with this connection because they themselves say, oh, those are the leaders that have been condemned in the past.
Right.
So he again takes something from the Old Testament, nails them between the eyes, which later I've read the same thing about how they viewed that. But he's just one, and the other interesting thing to see in all of this, the message never changes. It's hear my voice. It never changes. It's always saying, come to me, look at my works, hear my voice, be one of mine. That's the way.
Yeah. And that should make the salvation that you have even more valuable. God doesn't just save you from your sins. He doesn't just raise you from the dead. He doesn't just invite you into his family, but he makes you like him in the sense that you become a partaker of the divine nature. And that's where you have to be very careful with that God word, is that we are not being elevated to the divine creator status, but we are welcomed into his family. And as children of God, you become like him in the sense.
And can adopt his name. That's
Yes.
one explanation I read. It said it's like a family name. If you have a child, they take on your family name. And so God, when you think of especially in the sense of the trifold nature of God to start with, if you think of that as a family name, then when we become adopted children of God, part of that is that we can adopt his name, so we're his children. So we become, although not, like you said, not like him, but we become attached to him. So it's a familiar name.
Yes. And then all of the blessings that we have come from that attachment. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great way to think of it. So the early Christians did not shy away from saying that. This statement that we are gods is something that they would have said. And then they would have spent a long time clarifying exactly what they meant. Because if you're a pagan, Greco-Roman society, and somebody said this, you would think that they're claiming to be one of the pantheon. And so they would absolutely come along behind that and clarify it. But they didn't shy away from that. And I think what you said is that would have been a punch in the forehead for the religious leaders of the day. Dan?
I think verses 37 and 38 are two very profound verses, primarily because that is the way. I mean, Jesus really pleads with them here. It seems like the end of his argument with them. He says, look, you may not believe me, but believe my works, because my works prove who I am. And I think that really is where the rubber meets the road for us, because James follows that same argument and asks us, and basically commands us to act like we're Christians, because people may not believe us and what we say about the Lord and what we teach them, but they will believe our works. And so if we follow in these same footsteps, it will be effective.
Yeah. Also, that's a good opportunity to do a shameless plug for the summer series while we're closing. We're going to be studying the miracles of Jesus. And so the very things that Jesus would say, believe these things, That's what we'll be talking about this summer. Thank you, everybody, for your comments.